Hello everyone, and welcome back to Money Power Health with me, Nason Mani. This podcast is about the powerful yet often invisible forces that shape our health, and particularly those that relate to the commercial sector. This week, we're discussing so-called forever chemicals, or PFAS. These are a group of more than 10,000 man-made chemicals used in a wide range of industrial applications and consumer products. Of core interest to public health, they are also resistant to degradation, meaning they persist in the environment, contaminating water and soil, and ending up in our food chain and bodies, accumulating in people, animals, and plants. The rate and spread at which this is happening, combined with the health effects of such chemicals, some of which can affect reproduction and fetal development or cause cancer, has led to a range of new regulatory proposals to eliminate or reduce their use around the world. However, such developments face strong and coordinated lobbying efforts by the manufacturers of these chemicals. To discuss this issue, I'm joined by Vicky Cann from Corporate Europe Observatory. She is the co-author of their Chemical Reaction Report, which, alongside an international group of journalists and media outlets, documented extensive lobbying both in the EU and in individual member states. We'll discuss how industry lobbying is shaping the fate of PFAS regulation in Europe, what this means for public health and the environment, and why the Commission's receptiveness to corporate influence raises urgent questions about how we protect democratic decision-making from commercial capture. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Vicky. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks a lot for having me on.
Before we get into PFAS, I was just really interested in finding out a bit more about Corporate Europe Observatory and how you came to work there.
Sure. Corporate Europe Observatory has been going since 1997. That's 28 years. And we're a group of campaigners and researchers based in Brussels, but some of us are outside across Europe. I'm in the UK, and we expose and challenge corporate influence in the EU institutions. So I have colleagues working on fossil fuels, on pharmaceuticals, on big tech, and I'm in a team that looks at pesticides and chemicals like PFAS.
Wow. And may I ask how your own personal journey into this kind of work? Because it's quite a unique kind of organization and mission.
Yeah, CEO is quite unique. We're the only EU lobby watchdog, I would say, really looking into what's happening in the EU institutions when it comes to corporate influence. And my background is with trade unions in the UK, the trade union movement, but also other civil society groups. I've worked on environmental issues, public transport, more recently development issues. And that was how I first came across CEO, actually. I was working on water privatisation, and CEO was doing some really innovative work looking at the lobbying around and the corporate power around water privatisation, but also on what could be really effective publicly owned alternatives to privatisation. And that's where I first came across CEO in, I guess, the noughties. And I've been with CEO since, I think, 2011.
Wow. Amazing. And, I can't say that we've really solved or meaningfully addressed water privatization in the years since. It feels like, especially in the UK, we're really just living through the latest, worst consequences of that at the moment. But thank you so much for engaging in that nonetheless. And I wish more people would. It is really an example of moving upstream in a very literal sense.
Yes, it certainly is. And as you say, in the UK, we see the results of water privatisation very, very clearly in front of us. But when I was working on it, actually, our focus was more on the global south and the implications of water privatisation for poor people, and how actually water privatisation could mean that they no longer had access to clean, affordable water. Hence the campaign to develop effective publicly owned alternatives that can really tackle the global water and indeed sanitation crisis around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in some of our research, what we're coming across is water as a corporate social responsibility initiative, almost, sort of, rather than placing water as a kind of an essential utility for such communities, to a sort of a human right, essentially, to have access to clean drinking water, it becoming sort of a condition of allowing an alcohol company to have a large factory in the region and access to that water, and as a sort of a side or fringe benefit of that, improving water quality. And it sort of is a particularly egregious example of that sort of voluntary initiatives crowding out pretty fundamental human rights issues.
Yeah, I agree. There can be no more fundamental human right, I think, than the right to clean drinking water and to sanitation as well. And really, I find water privatisation and all the different forms of water privatisation that there is, from the full-on water privatisation to public-private partnerships to the kind of CSR initiative that you're talking about, none of them will deliver on the human right in the way that actually everybody around the world should be able to expect.
Absolutely. Well, and so on that point, I guess the human right to health and understanding the extent and the ways in which that is shaped by the environment around us is one of the big themes of the podcast. And as part of that, I thought the debate around PFAS and the lobbying around PFAS, right? Like the concept of these forever chemicals and how they're regulated or not and how they're framed or not, is, I think, a really powerful example of that tension between the fundamental right to health and commercial interests. And you've done a lot recently on this, and I was just wondering if you could maybe start by explaining a little bit more about PFAS and the types of risk they pose to health.
Yeah, so PFAS are also known as forever chemicals, and that's because they are extremely persistent. They are a class of 10,000, probably many, many more man-made chemicals. They've been around since the 1930s and 1940s. And the reason why they are so persistent is, or the persistency that they have, is one of the reasons why they are so prolifically used in industrial manufacturing, in pesticides, and can be found in many, many products. They are very strong carbon fluorine bonds, and they are very persistent in the environment. And indeed, I think if I, and probably the people listening to this podcast were to do a blood test, they would probably find PFAS in their blood. And if they were to test their drinking water, they would probably find PFAS in their drinking water as well. They are literally everywhere. And it's way overdue for regulators to get to grips and ban these substances, because not only are they persistent in the environment and found in the bloodstream, they are connected to a number of really worrying direct health effects, such as different kinds of cancer, blood pressure, preeclampsia, thyroid disease, liver damage, and for children, for people who are pregnant, for immunocompromised people, and for older people, they are especially at risk from the effects of PFAS.
Right, and in the report that you produced in January, you describe the kind of pushback, the corporate pushback on efforts to regulate PFAS at the EU, at the Commission level. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this fight, where these efforts to regulate PFAS originated from, and how long this kind of battle has been going on for.
Yes, so in at the start of 2023, 5 countries, 4 member states of the EU and Norway, produced a proposal to ban PFAS across the EU. Except in some cases where they felt that the use of PFAS was essential, and that there was, in those particular cases, no effective alternative substances yet. So for those areas, the proposal said that we will delay this ban for 5 years, or in some cases 12 years. So since this proposal in 2023, the proposal has been with the European Chemicals Agency, and they have been doing a deep dive investigation, if you like, an analysis of the proposal from these countries. There's been a big consultation process where industry and consumers and NGOs and others have been able to feed in their views on this proposal, and eventually the Chemicals Agency will then produce its opinion on this proposal. The proposal will then go to the European Commission in Brussels, the executive of the European Union, and it will then produce a proposal that the 27 member states will then take a decision on. So that's the background to the proposal. It's been around for a while, but even before 2023, indeed, those member states, those countries that made the proposal, they were consulting on aspects and talking to industry and others. But what we've seen, and what our investigation and the investigation of others has shown, is that there really has been an extremely intense effort by the PFAS industry itself. So that means the PFAS producers, the chemicals companies that produce these chemicals. So we're looking at companies such as Chemours, which is a US company with a Swiss base, which is a spin-off from the big US chemicals firm DuPont. We're looking at companies like Arkema, which is French, a number of other countries. We are seeing a big pushback against this proposal to ban PFAS, but we have also seen that not only are those producers mobilized against the proposal, that actually they have also mobilized the wider industry, the wider supply chains that then take those chemicals and use them in industrial processes, or use them in things like waterproof coats or food packaging or cosmetics or other applications. And so it's not just been the chemicals industry opposing this proposed ban, opposing, trying to get loopholes, trying to delay, trying to weaken, trying to derail the proposal. Actually, it's been a much wider industry effort, and we have seen all sorts of organizations and companies and trade associations involved, from big tech to renewable energy to the defense sector, a really wide range. And I would say it has become a really fraught political issue at the EU level.
Wow. And so there's just so much to get into here, but when you come across such a broad network of influence and such a wide range of stakeholders seemingly coordinated towards this, when you're writing a report like this, where does that take you? Does that change the ways you decide you're going to make an impact? Is part of it just about sort of exposing the scale and nature of that? Where do you take it from there when you actually uncover the breadth of networks you describe, not just from kind of chemical or agrochemical companies, but also more end users and associated industries?
Well, I guess as Corporate Europe Observatory, our one of our absolutely key roles is just to expose that this is happening, because lobbying is often unseen. I think a lot of chemical companies are not household names. So if I was to talk about big tech lobbying, of course, everyone knows about Google and Meta and of course X, but also known as Twitter. But actually, the chemical companies are not so well known. And anyway, we know that a lot of lobbying happens behind the scenes. So I think for us, a really key responsibility and role for us is just to expose that this is happening, and to bring it to people's attention, and also to challenge and question what industry is doing, because it's I think we live in a world where lobbying is expected and where it's normalized. Yeah. But actually, when we see that industry arguments are based on industry science, or when we see that indeed it's based on misinformation, when we see that industry is so much better resourced. There's private entities making millions of euros a year from PFAS. We can see the David and Goliath story, if you like, with industry being able to really throw serious amounts of money into trying to influence the direction of this public interest regulation. And also when we look at the history of how industry has consistently and repeatedly over decades at the EU level, but of course around the world, but our particular knowledge and expertise is at the EU level. We can see how industry has managed to undermine, delay and weaken chemicals regulation, such that we are in this situation in 2025 where, as I say, we are all contaminated with PFAS. That happened without our consent, without our knowledge, and we are being left with a huge bill, a huge cost of the environmental and the health implications of this contamination. So for us, there's a really primary motive to expose this and to make sure that industry does not, as far as we can, get away with it.
Absolutely. And I suppose it also helps tell part of a much bigger, longer term story, which you're alluding to in a way, which is that this is perhaps the latest expression of that kind of power asymmetry. But going back decades, there's also this kind of information asymmetry that relates to that. The idea that internally, very similar to what we have observed in the context of tobacco or fossil fuels, that there was this internal knowledge about the kind of nature and range of harms. And I think that was something that came through as quite compelling in some of the briefing documents that you produced as part of this, that there is this power asymmetry playing out at the moment, but it's layered on this kind of information asymmetry. So on the framing side, just on the basis of you having produced this report, what have you noticed in terms of its impacts and the sort of telling of that wider story? I mean, do you see it having pick up, and if so, with which audiences and in what ways?
I mean, when we produced our report, we did so in collaboration with a journalist project called the Forever Lobbying Project, which I can talk about in more detail in a minute. But collectively, there was a massive splash around PFAS, around the costs of PFAS, and around the exposure of the problematic industry lobbying on PFAS, and hopefully listeners will have seen it seen it on the news and read about it on news websites and in their morning paper. I certainly recognise now that that has helped to really boost awareness in the EU institutions, I would say, and externally about what is going on. I've spoken to the Commission. I know others have as well. It's great to be able to do other outreach like this podcast to be able to get the message out. But there is a real worry still that even with all that work and all that evidence about the problematic nature of the industry and its arguments, that at the moment the EU, like many parts of the world, unfortunately, is on a trajectory where the interests of industry seem to be being prioritised over everything else. There is a massive emphasis at the EU level now on competitiveness, whatever that might mean. But we know it's about making life easier for industry. There's a massive emphasis on deregulation, so not regulating more, but regulating less, and even unwinding some important rules and regulations that have already been passed at the EU level. And so all of this makes it a very, very difficult and challenging context to try and get a robust, comprehensive, ambitious EU PFAS ban as those 5 countries originally proposed, because there are these forces that are really seem to be a lot less interested in public health and environmental regulation, even from 5 years ago when we were in the heyday of the EU's Green Deal, and some of us felt that really the EU might be moving to a more progressive position. I'm afraid those days at the EU level are long gone. So the reaction to the report and the work of the Forever Lobbying Project has been positive in many quarters, but I'm still really worried whether we will be able to counter these much larger forces which are at work.
Yeah, a sobering thought, and I'd love to get on to the potential ripple effects of this, because my sense, particularly working with colleagues in the US and also in parts of the global South, is that there's either a challenge in kind of engaging in the sort of specifics of policy and regulation at the EU level is sort of nebulous a little bit, right? Like that this very particular set of mechanisms. And on the other hand, the idea that when not engaging in that, there can be this temptation to think that the EU is actually quite sort of precautionary in its approach to regulation, or that it has somehow a stronger hand or a stronger kind of pro-regulatory approach compared to some of these other contexts. But as you say, that's not really the case and hasn't been for some time. And there are these wider pressures, some of these really, really profound potential shifts that can kind of get lost in the mix of higher profile policy changes in the US and elsewhere. So really glad that we're talking about this. But before we get into that, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the Forever Lobbying Project, how it came about, your involvement in it, and what you think it kind of adds to this wider issue.
Yeah, the Forever Lobbying Project is the I guess second phase of a project that started a few years ago, which was called the Forever Pollution Project, and that is a journalistic project which brought together newsrooms from across Europe, coordinated by Le Monde in France. And the Forever Pollution Project, the first iteration of this, produced a really important set of tools, including a map of PFAS contamination sites. And I think it was really innovative work by journalists to really try and understand the exact extent of contamination of PFAS. And that map identified over 2,000 what they call PFAS hotspots, which are particularly around plants which produce PFAS, factories and others which might use PFAS, places like airports or military sites where there has been an extensive use of firefighting foam. But beyond that, actually, they identified over 20,000 places where there was high levels of PFAS contamination, and all across Europe, including in the UK. And The Guardian in particular has featured a lot of coverage looking at the contamination sites, or the primary contamination sites in the UK. So that was the Forever Pollution Project. But I think as the journalists were working on that, they became more and more aware that that actually there was a big industry lobby at work, and particularly then when the proposal to ban PFAS was published, and they could see the massive industry backlash against it, they and we decided that this really needed more investigation. So really over the year up until January 2025, we were working in collaboration. The newsrooms were investigating the lobbying that was happening at the national level, because, as I said at the beginning, the ultimate decision on this proposal will be made on a proposal by the Commission, the European Commission, but by member states. So there is a lot of lobbying, we know there is, at the member state level. So the newsrooms were mapping that. Meanwhile, we were mapping the lobbying that was happening at the EU level. So that means towards the Commission and the many different departments of the Commission, but also towards the European Parliament and towards the European Chemicals Agency, which is, as I said, is playing an absolutely key role in analysing the proposal that's been put forward and the consultation responses to it. The Forever Lobbying Project also did some other really important work, which again I think was incredibly innovative for journalists. They worked with independent experts, independent academics from a variety of different areas to do two things. The first one was to try and quantify in money terms the cost of environmental cleanup of all this PFAS contamination that they had previously mapped. And they did so in two scenarios, a scenario which was just with the existing PFAS contamination, and then into the future, especially if there is no regulation which starts to turn off the PFAS tap. And the figures that they found were absolutely astronomical, and these are figures that, unless the polluter pays principle is applied in really robust way, will find itself on the public purse, in that if no action is taken, no regulatory action, they predict a cost to the public purse of 100 billion euros a year, every year. Wow. In perpetuity. And that's just the environmental cleanup. That's not to do with the public health costs, for example, which is a whole nother area of billions of public expenditure. And of course, those figures are astronomical. And also, we need to make the point that actually the technology, even if we had that money, the technology doesn't exist at the moment to actually clean up PFAS at source, at scale anyway. So what we are doing is adding and adding and adding every year to this huge PFAS contamination without the money or the tech to deal with the environmental cleanup. So that was one aspect, one really innovative aspect of the Forever Lobbying Project. And the other really important aspect, which I was especially pleased to see was the way in which the journalists, again working with independent academics, really did a deep dive analysis into the arguments that industry is using. And I mean, these were arguments that were all over the lobbying documents that I was receiving via Freedom of Information. And they analysed them and looked at how credible they are. And on so many of these arguments, which they carefully categorised and analysed and researched, they found that the arguments didn't stack up, and in some cases were misinformation. And I think that kind of information has to be really compelling, must be really compelling for decision makers who ultimately will make the decision. But it's really scary to see how these are industry arguments, many of which have now been really debunked, I would say, by the Forever Lobbying Project, are and have been already adopted by decision makers at the national and EU levels. So this is really worrying, but I really feel that this project, and it's unusual, I think, to have an NGO working alongside or in collaboration with journalists in this way on the long term. I felt that as a kind of project, as a journalist project, I think it was pretty innovative. And the way that they worked, as I said, with independent academics and scientists was also innovative. And I think it really shows the way forward for other newsrooms around Europe and elsewhere on what's possible when you're prepared to devote the time and the capacity and the resources to these really meaningful and public interest investigations.
Yeah, I mean, it's inspirational really to think about how that collaboration and innovation can come together to counter what is an extremely well-funded and coordinated campaign of lobbying, right, that spans the development and testing of specific bits of argumentation and misinformation, and the kind of power mapping and analysis of who to lobby and how. Really, as you're saying it, I'm thinking, well, the only way to counteract that is with that kind of multi-level analysis of those fora and of those arguments in a way that involves civil society and investigative journalism, right? Because that is just the nature of this multi-level intervention that is this lobbying. Really fascinating. And you mentioned at the outset sort of your interest in things like, access to water, right, in the global south and privatization. And we've been talking a lot about this kind of EU level regulation, but it feels to me that there is a clear relationship and the potential for massive spillover effects here, because in some ways, when we look at areas like the regulation of tech companies and that kind of thing, the EU in some ways becomes a case study of what is or isn't possible. It's sort of one battleground, but a battleground that then shapes many other regulatory battlegrounds around the world. Do you have a sense of how this PFAS process is being viewed by industry and by advocates as sort of the first in many such cases, around the world in different regulatory contexts, or a kind of a key lobbying battle to oppose any kind of meaningful action as a way to reduce spillover in other jurisdictions?
I think the PFAS industry is really throwing everything at this battle because they see how if a comprehensive and ambitious ban does result in the EU, that could really help to drive regulation elsewhere. But of course, I think, as I said before, it is difficult times for those of us that believe in regulation to drive change, to prevent bad things, and to prioritize good things. To put it in really blunt, basic terms, I think in the US, I'm not fully up to speed on how, for example, Robert Kennedy is dealing with PFAS. I think I understand that before he came into office, he did raise some concerns about PFAS, and there is a patchwork of regulation across the states, for example, on drinking water and other elements of PFAS regulation. But I think with the Musk style attacks on regulation, I think that I could understand if that was now in doubt. I understand there is growing awareness, though, in Japan and a number of other jurisdictions, and it's not just in richer countries. I understand that there was a PFAS polluting plant in Italy, and when that company went bankrupt and there was local uproar about the contamination of the groundwater there, and a really growing sense of massive public concern about what on earth was the consequences of having this PFAS plant in their community, that actually that plant just shifted to India. So I think this really is a global problem, and even if the production is concentrated in particular areas, there is so much PFAS in consumer goods and in industrial uses, and all of those are used and ultimately has to be disposed of. That this really is a global problem. So the hope has to be, of course, that the EU will set a strong precedent for other countries and jurisdictions to follow. But it's going to be quite a challenge, honestly, I'm afraid.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's very important to restate and emphasize that, in part because this is one example of what could be several more, where deregulatory kind of supposedly pro-growth agenda at the EU level, combined with recent efforts we've seen to sort of defund civil society at the EU Commission level, could have really profound long tail consequences, right? Both in terms of disempowering and dissuading the kind of civil society support for more regulation and that kind of accountability frameworks, not just for PFAS, but for a whole range of other issues. On the US level, I'm sorry to say that as someone who does a bit more work in the US, there is a lot of concern, particularly outside health. I mean, so in both administrations, the first and the second Trump administration, modus operandi was very much bringing in US chemical industry lobbyists and sort of sympathetic voices into organizations like the EPA, who ultimately set the rules for how chemicals like PFAS chemicals are measured and their impacts tracked. And there seem to be really quite worrying developments in terms of making it much harder to track those impacts within the EPA, and even former administrators at the EPA really sort of being worried about those kind of efforts. So yes, it is definitely concerning times. I'm conscious of our time, and I really appreciate you being so honest about both the breadth and nature of this amazing work on PFAS, but also the importance of reflecting on the challenging times that we're in with regards to meaningful action. A lot of people listening to the podcast may be wondering how it is, what motivates you to keep working in these kind of areas in spite of the kind of challenges that you must be facing, not just the kind of macro challenges, right, around the potential future in this space, but also the micro challenges like pursuing freedom of information requests, piecing together lobbying meetings, because in my experience, that is all can be quite challenging in itself. Could you speak a little bit about the kind of challenges you face and how you maintain momentum in overcoming them?
Yes, I mean, you're right to mention that there are really worrying developments at the EU level for NGOs. There are attacks on funding sources. There are attacks, it seems, on sort of wider civic space, and this is so incredibly infuriating that the narrative is that there is this narrative being adopted by many politicians on the supposedly centre right, which is now really increasingly morphing into the extreme or far right, I would say, about how it's NGOs that need to be held to much higher standards when we are literally practically every day exposing corporate wrongdoing, lobbying, corporate misinformation, the double standards, the willful double standards is really challenging for particularly green NGOs at the moment at the EU level. I mean, but that also gives us the motivation and gives us the bit between our teeth in terms of standing up to these right-wing alliance between corporate interests and those politicians. It's not always easy to investigate lobbying, but I can say it's really key not to give up. I mean, you mentioned freedom of information, and our report, not entirely, but our report lent heavily on documents that we were able to get from the Commission and other institutions at the EU level, and those requests take time. They really, it feels like sometimes the institutions sit on the requests and very little moves forward over months. That's why this whole investigation took over a year, because some of the requests really took a long time to get through or get back to us. And then when we received the documents, we would get large redactions, large blacked out text of what looked like potentially quite juicy bits, or we would see that some documents just weren't being sent. And again, we would appeal. And again, that takes more time and more effort. But actually, I don't know, I would say 85-90% of times when I appeal on freedom of information at the EU level, I get more documents after I've appealed than I did initially. So, this kind of thing is challenging, but it's also, it's bloody motivating as well, I would say, because we don't want to let the decision makers get away with it. We don't want to let corporations and politicians get away with it. And actually, at the end of the day, these issues are so important. I mean, you know this probably far better than me, but when you've heard stories of mothers who are devastated to find out that when they thought that they were doing the right thing to breastfeed their babies, but then found that actually by breastfeeding, they'd actually increased the transfer of PFAS from themselves to their babies when they were living in PFAS hotspots. When you hear those kind of stories, when you read of the workers on the front line in these factories who have elevated levels of PFAS in their blood, and stories of local communities around industrial sites where they can't eat the vegetables that they grow in their back garden, they can't eat the eggs that their chickens in the backyard have produced. All of this is just a massive motivation that as society we must be able to run our lives in a better way, and we must be able to hold these companies to account for the huge damage that they've caused in the past and that they continue to cause today.
No, absolutely. And I think I was going to ask you about advice for early career folks, but you've summarized it so beautifully in exactly what you were describing, the importance of doing this kind of work in spite of these challenging circumstances. in part ultimately because it's kind of an expression of fundamental beliefs about the right to health, as we talked about at the outset, and the right to individuals and communities to be empowered to actually keep and build health among themselves and their children and their neighbours. This has been a really fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and all the work that has gone into this report and others. Is there anything, just before we close, anything you wanted to flag that's coming up that people should be either looking to come from your organization or more developments in PFAS more generally that you wished people would spend more time looking at, worrying about and organizing on?
Well, I think the point that you made about comparing PFAS and the PFAS industry to the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry. I mean, that's a comparison that we take really, really seriously, because we know that for decades the PFAS industry knew about the consequences of what they were doing. And we know that they have fought tooth and nail against regulation on chemicals again for decades, and the parallels there are really, really clear. But there's another really important lesson, I think, that we should take from the efforts to control the tobacco lobby. You will know better than me that the World Health Organization has rules in place that have actually been adopted by member states, countries and institutions around the world, which reflect the fact that the tobacco industry has nothing constructive to say about public health policy making, and therefore should not be through the door or around the table on public health decision making. Now, and those rules are in place. They're imperfectly implemented and applied, and as we know, the tobacco industry has not packed up and gone away. But actually, I think as those rules have been enforced around the world, actually we have seen a growing increase in the strength of regulation against tobacco. And we find this model really, really important. And for the last few years, my colleagues working on fossil fuels have been involved in campaigns at the UN level, at the climate COPs, but also at the EU level. And I know they're in member states, including the UK as well, to see the fossil fuel industry in the same way. That, again, they have nothing constructive to add about the need to tackle the climate crisis, and they will only try and thwart progressive regulation and legislation. So they must not be allowed in the lobby rooms. And we feel that this model is something which could equally apply to the PFAS industry and indeed the producers of wider harmful chemicals. So, and that's it's a campaign which we would like, and messaging and I think framing that we would increasingly like to get out there, because we need to find new ways of making sure that the chemicals industry doesn't delay and derail progressive rules. And it is vital, I think, that decision makers no longer see this industry as a reliable and a trustworthy partner, because they're not. So I don't know if that's ending on a moment of optimism, but I guess I wanted to include that, because for us that's really a key way forward for how, as a movement, as public health and environmental activists, that we can really start to try and restrict the lobbying influence and the regulatory capture of this industry.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And in a way, it's the logical conclusion of anyone who really cares about regulation in these individual spaces, right, around these individual issues, is that we need, if we care about the pollution of the environment, then we also care about the pollution of policy spaces. We care about the pollution of discourse and public understanding, right? We care about the pollution of science, because really it is that pollution, it is that level of commercial influence over these kind of mechanisms that ultimately lead to the challenges you've so beautifully described in the context of PFAS. And ultimately, you're right, that is the mechanism. You know, Article 5.3 in the FCTC is an example of that. It has been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing in this space, Vicky, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed our conversation as well.
Well, that's it for another episode of Money Power Health. It was an absolute pleasure to have Vicky on the show. I really encourage you to look into the work of Corporate Europe Observatory on this and other issues. If you're interested in some of the topics we covered, I'll leave links to relevant materials in the show notes. Thank you as always for listening. If you have ideas for future episodes or guests, please feel free to drop me a link. I'll leave Charlie to read us out.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving a rating. It helps other people find it. The music in this podcast was by Daniel Manny. You can find more information about his music in the show notes. This announcement was read by the very talented Charlie Manny.